What's good, YouTubers and YouTubettes? This is JBsports back again with another one. The welterweight division has a rich history in the sport of boxing. You talk about Sugar Ray Leonard versus Thomas Hitman Hearns. In my opinion, the biggest welterweight title matchup in boxing history. You want to talk about the biggest fight here recently between two young, undefeated American fighters, pound for pound fighters, when they met up, and that was Oscar De La Hoya versus Sugar Shane Mosley. Right after that fight transpired, you want to talk about another big welterweight matchup featuring Oscar De La Hoya versus Felix Trinidad. And hopefully, in 2022, we get Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford, because that fight is right up there with those three mega fights. It's an exclusive company if it does go down. It's in rarefied air if it comes to fruition. And hopefully, if negotiations go well, this fight will finally go down between the top two, in my opinion, pound for pound, and the top two in the welterweight division. The last time we seen the number one versus the number two pound for pound fighter was James Toney versus Roy Jones Jr. And I believe this fight will be right up there with that fight as far as anticipation, as far as a true 50-50 fight between two undefeated champions. Let's talk about the state of negotiations between Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. First of all, if this fight goes down, it's going to be on Showtime pay-per-view. Steven Espinosa wants to put this fight on Showtime pay-per-view. Steven Espinosa has been very aggressive here in recent years, putting on big fights. You know, he's done a bunch of pay-per-views with Tank Davis and Jake Paul. Those pay-per-views have done good numbers for Showtime. He's also put on the first Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury fight. So he's been very, very aggressive. He also recently just put on the Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas pay-per-view fight. Before that, he did Manny Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas. So Showtime has been very, very aggressive. Maybe Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas was on Fox pay-per-view, but if my memory serves me correctly, that fight was on Showtime pay-per-view also. But anyway, the last 2 years, Showtime has shown all the big-time pay-per-view matches involving PBC fighters. And PBC is where it's at as far as these negotiations go. Now, PBC is led by Al Haymon. And for Terrence Crawford to get the fight with Errol Spence Jr., he's going to have to sign with Al Haymon as his advisor. That's the only way this fight is going to happen. That's the only way this fight is going to come to fruition, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you know, I talked about this several months back when they first was talking about negotiations, seriously negotiating this fight. You know, what was going on during the time that Errol Spence Jr. was in preparation for the Yordenis Ugas unification fight. And I did a video saying that, look, for the fight to happen, it ain't got nothing to do with no 50-50. 50-50 is not a problem, because Errol Spence Jr. in his last fight versus Yordenis Ugas, that fight was 50-50. Now, the guarantee was different, as Errol Spence Jr. got $1.5 million guarantee and Yordenis Ugas got $1 million guarantee. So I think that's going to be the blueprint for Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Bud Crawford. They're going to do a 50-50 guarantee. My bad, they're going to do a 50-50 on the purse split. But the guarantee is where they're going to have to come to an agreement, because if Terrence Crawford is steadfastly stating that he must get 50-50 across the board, then the fight's not going to happen either. He's going to have to take a lesser guarantee than Errol Spence Jr. We ain't talking about no 70-30 or 80-20 split on the guarantee. We're not talking about that. And all these people that was talking about 80-20, Errol Spence Jr. is asking for 80-20, and he asking for 70-30 in negotiations, that is not true. That's fake news. All you got to do, again, is look at what Yordenis Ugas got versus Errol Spence Jr. He got a 50-50 deal. Now, you think they're going to offer Ugas 50-50, but they ain't gonna offer Terence Crawford 50-50. If that is the case, that means they don't want to fight. That's crazy. That is crazy. But that's not, from what I'm hearing, an obstacle in this fight getting done. I think the problem is, again, Terence Bud Crawford must sign with Al Haymon. He must sign Al Haymon as his advisor. Because when you look at all the mega pay-per-view fights involving PBC, it's been 2 Al Haymon advised fighters. Now, the only way you can go around there is you get into a mandatory position, and then you fight one of Al Haymon fighters, and then, you know, whoever represents you win the purse split, win the purse bid, or Al Haymon wins the purse bid. That's the way you can kind of get around actually having to sign with Al Haymon. That's the only way. Or you're one of those guys. There's only one guy out there, actually. That's Canelo Alvarez. When you're the cash cow of boxing, the face of boxing, they'll be willing to, do a deal with you with no strings attached, just like Canelo Alvarez did when he negotiated the Caleb Plant fight. He got that fight, won that fight, and moved on, and his next fight was on the Zone, and he was promoted by Matchroom Boxing. Terence Bud Crawford is not on the same level as a Canelo Alvarez as far as what he brings to the table monetarily wise. He don't do the numbers Canelo Alvarez does, and obviously he's not the face of boxing, so he's not going to be able to come there and say, okay, I just want to fight Errol Spence Jr. with no strings attached. He's not going to be able to do that. So he's going to have to sign with Al Haymon as his advisor, or the fight's not going to get done. He's going to have to accept a little bit less of a guarantee than an Errol Spence Jr., or the fight's not happening. He's going to get his 50-50 purse split, make no mistake about it. But I think he's going to have to understand that he's not going to be able to get what he made against Sean Porter, where he walked home with $6 million. That's before taxes. He's not going to be able to get that. I think the guarantee probably could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 million for Errol Spence Jr. and $4 million for Terence Bud Crawford. You got to understand that the PBC has all the leverage, because the elephant in the room goes by the name of Keith One-Time Thurman. Let me say that again. The elephant in the room goes by the name of Keith One-Time Thurman, because he's advised by Al Haymon, unlike Terence Bud Crawford, and he's one of the top fighters under the PBC, even at this stage of his career. You know, when the PBC first got that big network deal with Fox, NBC, and CBS, if I'm not mistaken, then they had a deal with ESPN too. One of their 4 headline fighters were, it was Deontay Wilder, it was Danny Garcia, it was Leo Santa Cruz, and it was Keith One-Time Thurman. Those were the 4 fighters that they were putting all their backing behind. And he's still one of the top names under the PBC. He still sits atop of the food chain when you talk about the PBC. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen. So, despite what you heard Errol Spence Jr. say, he don't have no interest in fighting Keith One-Time Thurman. If Errol Spence Jr. can't get the Terence Bud Crawford fight, it's only one other fight that the PBC is going to be able to put on pay-per-view. Because the other option is Stayonis. Stayonis just won the regular version of the WBA belt. He's in line to take on Errol Spence Jr. He's in the #1 position. But if that fight goes down, I find it hard to believe the PBC puts that fight on pay-per-view. If they do, they better lower the pay-per-view. They better not put that at no higher than $39.99. Because they put that thing, anything over $39.99, his numbers are going to drop compared to the numbers that he did with Yordenis Ugas and Mikey Garcia, Sean Porter, and those guys. He'll be lucky to do $150,000 with Stayonis. So we will see what happens, and we will see what transpires. But that's the state of the negotiations. That's what's the 2 obstacles that could prevent this fight from happening. Now, Terence Crawford just finished up his contractual obligations with Top Rank Boxing and ESPN. So I don't think he's really wants to be tied in with any other promotional or any other platform where he's tied in, where he must deliver fights that they are putting on. I don't think he wants to be in that situation again, but he's got to look at the situation that he's in. He's got to look at what's best for his career, what's best for his legacy. He might want to look to one of his friends in boxing, that being Devin the Dream Haney. Devin the Dream Haney Didn't really want to sign with top-ranking Bob Arum, but he knew to get the fights that he wanted to get and make those legacy-defining fights and enhance his resume and become one of the top dogs in the boxing and become one of the sport's biggest stars, he had to align himself with Bob Arum. Bob Arum had the fighters that he needed to fight to ultimately reach his goal, that being undisputed at lightweight division. And then if he's able to do that, win both of those fights with Kambosos, that will put him in his first ever pay-per-view against one of the biggest names in boxing, Vasily Lomachenko. Terence Bud Crawford need to follow that same blueprint. If he's able to defeat Errol Spence Jr., he'll then be able to set the stage to take on the winner of Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano. Now, that's another opponent that Errol Spence Jr. can get after the Ugas fight, if a Crawford fight does not come to fruition. Because, again, Jermell Charlo has said he's not going to fight Errol Spence Jr. They're both trained by Derek James, but if Brian Castano wins the fight, Brian Castano just came out here today and said that he would love for Errol Spence Jr. to come up to 154, that he would welcome Errol Spence Jr. up at 154, junior middleweight division. So that would be a title shot for Errol Spence Jr. That would definitely be a Showtime pay-per-view matchup, as one of the biggest stars in boxing will be attempting to get another belt in a different weight class. So we will see what happens, and we will see what transpires. But the bottom line is the PBC got all the leverage. Al Haymon is not going to let Terence Crawford come over here, not advise or not sign with him, and beat Errol Spence Jr. right off into the sunset. You know what I'm saying? Or able to maybe move up and fight another Al Haymon advised fighter in Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano and beat them and then move on. He's going to have to sign a contract with Al Haymon as his advisor. That's just the bottom line. That's the number one thing he's got to do for this fight to transpire. And the number two thing he's got to do is accept a lesser guarantee than Errol Spence Jr. 50-50 is not a problem. He will get 50-50, just like Yordenis Ugas got 50-50, just like Shawn Porter got 50-50. But just like Shawn Porter and Ugas got a lesser guarantee to Errol Spence Jr. when they fought him, Bud Crawford's going to have to accept a lesser guarantee than Errol Spence Jr. also. If he's not willing to do that, then that's another roadblock for this fight actually happening. Let me know your thoughts about Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Bud Crawford. Do you think this fight finally goes down, or do you think that Terence Bud Crawford's stubbornness will prevent this fight from happening? A lot of people are going to try to blame Errol for the fight not happening, but just look at the blueprint that Yordenis Ugas had no problem following, and then Shawn Porter had no problem following. Both of those guys were championing going into those fight with Errol Spence Jr., just like Terence Bud Crawford is a champion going into the fight with Errol Spence Jr. Shawn Porter had one belt. Yordenis Ugas had one belt each as they brought into the ring fighting Errol Spence Jr. Terence Bud Crawford has one belt. Now, Terence Bud Crawford has done more than those two guys. Terence Bud Crawford is rated higher than those two guys, but when you just look at all three guys being champions, I think that you must follow that same blueprint for this fight to finally come to fruition. Let me know your thoughts. Follow me on Twitter, JBsports 3303. Like, share, and subscribe to JB Sports. The man, the myth, the legend. And I holla.